So today we're wrapping up our series, The F Words, which, as we said, is kind of a funny name, right? But what we're really trying to do is just kind of capture this idea that in life we often get stuck. We kind of find ourselves in a place that it's just hard to move on from. It's hard to make progress, kind of emotionally, from where we are. And throughout the series, everything we've talked about begins with the letter F. Right? So remember, the first week, we launched off with the word faith. And as we said that, faith isn't some kind of magic. What faith is believing that something or someone will do what they say they will do. And so, as we say we have faith in God, we say we believe that God's going to do what he says he's going to do. And the reason that that's important is because at any moment in our lives, things may not feel like they're going that well. And faith is what allows us and enables us to carry on even when things aren't going the way we'd like them to. And then last week, we talked about forgiveness. And forgiveness is this idea that when someone harms us, we don't hold it against them, that we're willing to let that go and release it. And the way we release it, in general, is that we turn it over to God. That we're going to trust that God can pull these things together for us. So this week, as we wrap up, I want to look at another aspect of forgiveness. And this is, I think, the absolutely most difficult kind of forgiveness there is. Forgiving ourselves. That as we go through life, we do things that we don't feel good about. That we make mistakes and we create damage. And that damage can be hard to forgive ourselves for. I mean, at my point in my life, I am 56 years old. That is 56 years to have messed things up. Right? And in that time, I have hurt people. And I have said things that I can't take back. And I've done things that have hurt people in a way that I can never fix. And I think we all have things like that happen over the years. And if we're not careful, we can see ourselves getting stuck by that, because if we don't move on from what we've done, we're never going to get free. Because what do we talk about with forgiveness? Forgiveness is turning things over to God. And when we have these issues in our lives that we can't get past, we need to be able to turn them over to God. So as we wrap up the series, our last title is actually 2 F words. Fully free. Now, I know that sounds corny, fully free. What does that mean? What do we do with that? But what it comes down to is that how we see ourselves impacts every single aspect of our lives. That if we see ourselves in a negative light, well, we're not going to be able to get very far. That if we see ourselves as less than good, that's going to leave us stuck. Right? So if we're going to be free, we need to forgive ourselves. We've got to somehow move on beyond our mistakes. So how do we do that? Because holding on to our mistakes is toxic. So if we're going to move on, do we just say that, hey, I've hurt people, I don't care? I do things, but I don't want to carry that around, so I'm just not going to worry about it anymore. Well, that's not healthy. That's neurotic at best, psychotic at worst, sort of thing, right? That if we're hurting people, we need to deal with that. So kind of the first step in any situation where we hurt people is the basics. If you hurt somebody, what do? Say you're sorry, right? That we don't just move on. We actually own what we've done, and we apologize to people. But we need to go further than that, right? That if we actually take something from someone or break something of someone's, we have to replace it. We need to do our best to make restoration, right? Those are kind of the basics. They're the things you'll learn when you're a kid. And when we do that, that certainly helps. But what happens when you've done something you can't fix? Right? Because if you lash out at anger in someone and you say horrible things to them, saying you're sorry doesn't take those words away. It doesn't take that pain away. Or if you've done something in your past that there's no way to move on from, saying you're sorry doesn't really cleanse us. It's the best we can do, it seems, but we need something more than that. That if we hang on to that stuff for too long, it's going to tear us apart. And there's actually a movie from back in 2004 that I think actually kind of captures this idea really, really well. It's called The Machinist. Now, I don't know if you've seen it. It was an independent film. If you haven't seen it, don't. It's a dark film. Right? It's a really dark film, but it does star Christian Bale. So if you're a Christian Bale fan, that's kind of okay. Right? Batman, in case you're wondering. Right? The thing that's interesting about that movie is that when you meet Christian Bale at the beginning of the movie, he looks pretty normal. He looks like a kind of an okay guy. And throughout the movie, he goes through this kind of weird transformation. He just starts getting skinnier and skinnier. And you don't quite know why. And you know he has insomnia, and he has this insomnia that lasts for more than a year. And even though it was an independent film, it got a lot of notoriety because Christian Bale actually lost over 60 pounds to make the film. So he's a guy roughly my size who got down to 120 pounds. And so he looked really sickly and emaciated. And in the movie, you don't understand why. And then as you get to the very end of the movie, there's a flashback to a time frame before the movie starts. And in this really short flashback, you see a very healthy-looking, Batman-looking Christian Bale driving a car, and he hits someone and kills them. And no one sees it. So he gets in the car, and he drives away. And what you see in this movie is his guilt tearing him apart. And what the movie makers did that I thought was so effective is that they used this physical imagery of what's happening to his body to represent what happens inside of us when we have guilt that we don't break free of, that when we carry this load from our past that we haven't dealt with and we haven't been able to break free from. Now, that's a pretty ugly picture, and I don't want any of us to go through that sort of thing. So what do we do? What do we do with that past that's so hard to forgive ourselves for? Well, I think actually the answer can be found, or at least starts with, what is probably the most famous verse in the Bible. It actually comes from what we call the book of John or the Gospel of John. Right? And the book of John is basically just an account of the life of Jesus written by somebody who hung out with him, whose name was John. Right? So John actually started following Jesus when he was a very young man, as a teenager, a pretty young teenager, we think. And in what we call the book of John, John wrote down the things he saw Jesus do and the things he heard Jesus say. And one of the things he wrote down is this very famous line. It comes John 3:16. If you ever watched a football game, you've seen the sign in the end zone, right? John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. Now, one of the reasons that verse is so popular is that fundamentally what it does is it summarizes what we call the gospel, right? The good news of Jesus. That one verse kind of captures the overall picture. And the thing that I find interesting is that one verse also kind of encapsulates the things we've been talking about in this series. That it really comes down to faith and forgiveness. Because basically, if we look at the verse and it says that everyone who believes in him, what is that? That's faith, right? That's saying that we have faith that Jesus is who he says he is, and he did what he said he did. He said he was the Son of God and came to earth with the full authority of God. And in his work and his life and his resurrection, he then fulfills the requirements for redemption with God. In other words, that he actually gives us a path to forgiveness. That through our faith in Jesus, we find forgiveness. And in the promise in this verse is, it leads to eternal life. In other words, that it leads to an eternal presence with God. Right? That's kind of fundamentally what the gospel is. We believe, nothing more than believe. We have faith that Jesus is who he says he is. We receive forgiveness. And from that, we have eternal life. Now, I believe that verse means exactly what it says. But I think that sometimes, as Jesus followers, sometimes we look at that relationship a little bit narrowly. In other words, I don't think we always recognize what it really means to be in relationship with Jesus. That sometimes we get very focused on this idea of an eternal life, that the whole deal is that if I believe, I get eternal life. And that's the whole picture. But it's much more than that, I believe that focusing just on this idea of eternal life, just focusing on what happens when we die, causes us to miss out on some of the best things about a relationship with Jesus. That Jesus wanted us to understand that it's not about punching a ticket to get to heaven. I mean, that's nice, it's good, I'll take it, right? But he wants us to see that there's way more than that it's not just about the distant future. It's not about what happens when you die, or at least it's not only about what happens when you die. That he wanted to make clear that this relationship changes everything in our lives. And in fact, as John recorded what Jesus experienced, what he would often record is when Jesus would engage with the religious leaders of that time. Remember that the religious leaders at that time actually opposed Jesus, that they didn't believe he was who he said he was, and they didn't believe he was going to do what he said he would do. And so John would often record these exchanges that Jesus would have. And in one exchange, as these leaders are kind of really saying that, we don't think you're doing that. Why are you here? This is blasphemy. What are you talking about? Jesus made clear that his purpose was far beyond just eternal life. In this exchange, Jesus says, I came so they would have life and have it abundantly. In our relationship with Jesus, what Jesus wants us to understand is that it's not just about what happens after we die, that there's this transformation that begins, and it begins immediately, that this relationship of faith causes our lives to start to go in a different direction. Now, that doesn't mean that everything gets fixed all at once, right? That doesn't mean that all your problems suddenly go away. But what it does mean is that through faith, we start down a road, we start down a path of renewal, and things begin to change. And so what Jesus invites us into, that as we have this expression of faith, he invites us into a relationship. And in that relationship, we can begin to let go of the things that haunt us from our past. And in that relationship, we can begin to embrace a newness of life. Now, this is a transformation that none of us ever finish. If you've been a Jesus follower since you were a child, you know that you've been going through a process your whole life. If you became a Jesus follower as an adult, you know that you're in a process that you go through. But it's this process that's transformational, but also the process itself is kind of part of the point. That the things that begin to happen to us in that process, in that relationship, is part of what makes us who we are. And it's all those mistakes that we have brought with us that we can now see through a different lens of healing, that empower us to reach out to the people around us and to reach into this hurting world around us and use our experiences and our pain and the things that we've been through to help other people through their pain and through their experiences. And as we go through this process of transformation, sometimes the progress is slow. But God leads us through it. And if you're like me, I just want to get to the end. God, what do I need to do to be fixed? Let's go. And it doesn't seem to work that way. In fact, the more I try to make it work that way, the longer it seems to take, sort of thing. It's about stepping into it and surrendering and trusting that this is really a relationship. Because what we find is that when we take the time to connect more deeply with God, we become better able to connect with one another. And all this happens because of faith. By simply having faith that Jesus is who he says he is, and he did what he said he would do. Now, it's kind of interesting that if you're like me, I grew up in a very, 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 very conservative church where there were all kinds of rules about what you could do and what you couldn't do. And what I've discovered kind of throughout my life is that even though Jesus is very clear about this idea that this relationship is based on faith, people seem to have trouble embracing that. Many of us at different points in our lives struggle with this idea that's just about faith, that there always seems to be this kind of other aspect. The religious word for it is a works-based path, that we try to earn our way into relationship with God. Because I think sometimes it's just like, just faith? Come on, there's got to be more to it than that. It can't be that simple. And so we start trying to layer things on top of faith. And I think sometimes we feel like because of our pain from our past, that we feel like we need to prove to God that we're good enough. And we start doing a bunch of extra stuff and start adding a bunch of rules and a bunch of things we need to do. And the thing is that was never what it was about. That it was always about this thing that was so beautifully simple that it's actually hard to believe. That it really just comes down to faith. But over the centuries, people have added rules, and religions have added rules, and churches have added rules. And they have you have tos, and you have to do these sort of things. Like when I was growing up, if you were a guy and your hair was too long, that was a sin. If you're a girl and your hair was too short, that's a sin. Kind of like, why? Why is it like that? Why is it like that? Because Jesus never said any of those things. Yet somehow, these sort of things are out there all the time, that there's this kind of recurring attitude, this recurring idea that there need to be rules. What's kind of interesting is that when I launched this series, which was October 31st, many of us, I didn't even realize until really recently, October 31st is actually a really important date, beyond the candy, by the way. Is that October 31st is the day that Martin Luther, I'm not a big church historian kind of guy, but Martin Luther made a really big declaration in 1517 on October 31st. Is that he looked around and he said that religion is starting to hold people down, that religion has become about rules. And Martin Luther said, it's not about rules, it's about faith. And he made a huge declaration on that day. And so as we launch into this series, this whole idea about faith, forgiveness, and freedom was really the message that Martin Luther wanted to launch into 404 years ago. And something that we still, this church wasn't even here yet, huh? Hard to imagine. We were almost here, but we weren't quite here 400 years ago. 200 years ago we were, but not 400, right? And so the thing that I want us to understand is that this is a constant, I don't want to say threat, it's a constant trend of faith, is that faith has this tendency to be pulled into legalism or religiosity. And it starts to take over on us. And we want to be really mindful of that. And as I was getting ready for this message today, and I was kind of digging into things, it's kind of interesting that as far as we can tell, this has been an issue kind of going almost back to the beginning. Because in what we call the book of Galatians, now the book of Galatians is actually a letter. It's a letter written by the Apostle Paul. And what the Apostle Paul did, if you think about it, is that he was kind of a missionary. What he did is he would go around to different places. He would hang out there for a while. He would set up a church. He would establish church leadership. And then he would go on to somewhere else. And one of the earlier churches he created or planted was called a place called Galatia. And what happened is that when he left, some other people came in and started adding a bunch of rules. And the thing that's interesting is that this letter that we call the book of Galatians, if we figure that Jesus' crucifixion was around the year 30 to 35 in that window, this letter was written somewhere between the early 40s and the late 50s. Meaning that somewhere between 10 and 25 years after Jesus, that early, this whole idea of layering rules and legalism was already starting to happen. And so what Paul wanted to do was make it really clear that this whole idea about rules is not what it's about. In fact, it's really interesting that this book, Galatians, was actually one of the real big catalysts for Martin Luther to make the declaration that the church is kind of getting out of bounds with all these rules. And so in this letter, Paul wants to make it abundantly clear that it's about faith, and it's simply about faith. So in this letter that Paul writes, he says, it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. What was happening was the people in that church were teaching that faith is important, but it's just a starting point. That there were a bunch of things that you had to do beyond faith, that there were a bunch of rules that you had to follow, there was a certain lifestyle you had to live. Again, they were actually starting to bring in religiosity. And Paul wants to make it really clear that no, Jesus has set us free. And the wording is kind of funny. It's for freedom that Christ has set us free. And the point he's making here is that Jesus set us free, and he wants us to live in freedom. He does not want us burdened down by rules. He doesn't want people telling you that God expects something more from you beyond faith, that your relationship with God is not tied into anything beyond faith. He doesn't want you to try to be good enough. He doesn't want you to try to earn his love. He wants us to accept that we are loved. And I think for many of us, that simple idea of just accepting that you are loved completely, exactly as you are, for some of us, that might be the hardest thing anyone could ask us to do. But what Paul wanted to make abundantly clear, that each and every one of us are loved unconditionally by God. And in that there is freedom. You were created to be exactly who you are. And embrace that truth that you don't have to try to be something better, something different, something alternative to be loved by God. You are who you are, and God always knew you'd be that. And in that, he loves you completely and totally. So as Paul's point here was that anytime someone says that you have to follow rules or you have to behave in a certain way to fulfill or to receive God's love, what he's saying, that person is trying to enslave you. They are trying to steal your freedom away from you. And he's saying, do not let them do that. But of course, Paul then anticipated a follow-on question. That, well, if faith is all I need for a relationship with God, does that mean that what I do doesn't matter at all? So I can kind of take on a kind of completely hedonistic viewpoint and just think about myself and do those sort of things? Well, it certainly wouldn't cost you God's love, but Paul does want us to understand that that's not really the point. That our freedom comes with something that empowers us to do something. Because in that same letter, Paul would go on and say, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. Now that phrase, indulge the flesh, it's kind of like, well, that's a weird phrase. What does that mean? And the thing to understand is that these letters were not written in English, right? These letters were originally written in Greek. And where it says indulge the flesh, specifically the word flesh, the Greek word that's translated as flesh doesn't actually mean flesh and blood. What it actually means is that they viewed the person as having different parts. And the Greek word that's translated as flesh is that part of us that's temporal, that passes away, that dies in the end. And so what Paul is saying is that don't use this freedom to indulge yourself in things that don't matter and things that go away and things that are fleeting. Don't use your freedom to do that. Instead, use your freedom to be bold, to serve one another, to be willing to step out and do things that frighten you, to care for other people, to be willing to step out beyond your capabilities and believe that God will bring you through, to serve other people and to take care of other people. And then he continues on. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, where he refers to the law, the specific challenge that he was dealing with in this church in Galatia was when that church was first founded, most of the Jesus followers in that church had grown up Jewish, which means that they had grown up with the Jewish traditions. And that Jewish tradition is actually called the law. This was the way they ate. It was their lifestyle, the holidays they followed, other aspects of their lives. And one of the things that people who grew up in that tradition, they felt that one of the key aspects of the law was that living that way made them easily identifiable as the people of God. And so what they were saying is that, well, if you're a Jesus follower, you have to do all those Jewish things too. And so as other people came around, they were trying to get these other people to live by the law. And Paul's like, no, that's not what this is about. And the key thing he does is that when he says that the law is fulfilled, he then quotes Jesus. And he says, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the reason he's quoting that particular phrase from Jesus is because Jesus said that the way people will know that you're my follower is because you are so loving to the people around you. That if you want to be identified as a Jesus follower, it's not about those rules. It's about stepping out in love and serving one another and caring for one another. So my friends, that as we finish up, the thing that I want us to fully embrace is that through faith in Jesus, we receive an incredible gift. A gift that's so much bigger than we can imagine. And when we only focus on what happens to us when we die, we're missing this immediate beauty of this gift. That through our faith in Jesus, we've entered into a relationship with God. We've entered into a relationship with Jesus. And Jesus wants to be with us in our day-to-day. Not because he wants to scold us when we're bad. He wants to be in this relationship with us, so he's sharing our lives with us, and we're sharing our lives with him. And in that, we find freedom, that we don't have to be fearful, that we don't have to worry about rules. We don't have to act a certain way because someone expects us to. We don't have to look a certain way because someone expects us to. We don't have to dress a certain way because someone expects us to. What Paul wants us to understand, and what I would hope we could all embrace, is that Jesus' death and resurrection gives us freedom. And in that freedom, we can step out in love and begin to serve people in ways that might be scary to us otherwise. That gives us the freedom to say, you know what, God, I'm only able to do this much, but I believe you want me to do this much, so I'm going to try. Or maybe you're a software developer in your 50s and you go, you know what, maybe I'm meant to do something more than this. And maybe you're willing to stand in front of a room that you feel completely unqualified to stand in front of and tell people that God says, I think I should say this to you. And it scares you every Sunday morning. You get up at 4 o'clock every Sunday morning, convinced that this is the day you're not going to make it. And it's 10:40 and I'm still here. All right? So it looks like I'm going to make it today. But that is my Sunday morning every single Sunday. Who do you think you are to think you can do this? I'm nobody, but I'm someone who's loved, and in that God moves through me, and I'm convinced that that is true for every one of us here. Because I love that song, Nobody, not because it's saying that we're nobody, but we're saying that our identity is not tied up in the things that we do. Our identity is connected to the one who loves us. And you are loved unconditionally by a God, no matter what you've done, no matter what you've been through, and no matter where you have been. And in that, he will move through you to do more than you can possibly imagine. So I ask that each of us be willing to just grab onto that gift that he's given us, and let's step out and do what he calls us to do.